I looked through my patio window and saw my 58-year-old mother kissing my husband. I did not scream. I did not cry. I pulled out my phone, pressed record, and documented the evidence. Then I called my father and told him he needed to come home right now. What pulled into my driveway 10 minutes later was a plot twist none of us saw coming. My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old. As a forensic accountant, I have spent my entire career tracking missing money, finding hidden assets, and exposing corporate liars. I deal in fax numbers and undeniable proof. But nothing could have prepared me for the audit of my own marriage. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who betrayed your trust. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was supposed to be in Chicago for a massive corporate audit. The assignment was scheduled to take a full week, but my team and I found the financial discrepancies 3 days early. I changed my flight and decided to come home early to surprise my husband Spencer. Spencer is 34 and works in wealth management, or at least that is what his business cards say. The truth is, he spends most of his time networking at the country club and relying heavily on the income I bring home. I thought we had a solid marriage. I thought the late nights and the stress were just part of building our life together. I took a cab from the airport to our home in the suburbs. The weather was unusually warm for an autumn afternoon. The leaves were turning crisp shades of orange and gold, crunching beneath the tires of the cab as it pulled away. Instead of walking through the front door and announcing my arrival, I decided to go through the side gate. I wanted to see the look on his face when I walked through the sliding glass doors of the patio. Our house has a beautiful backyard with a large deck and floor-to-ceiling windows that look directly into the living room. I quietly unlatched the wooden gate and stepped onto the stone pathway. My rolling suitcase was small, and I lifted it by the handle so the wheels would not make a sound against the pavement. I walked up the wooden steps of the deck. The afternoon sun was reflecting off the glass, making it slightly difficult to see inside at first. I stepped closer to the window, expecting to see Spencer sitting on the couch with his laptop or watching a sports game. Instead, I saw two figures tangled together on our expensive cream-colored linen sofa. For a fraction of a second, my brain could not process the image. I thought perhaps Spencer had a client over, or that my eyes were playing tricks on me because of the glare from the sun. I shifted to my left, stepping into the shadow of the patio umbrella. The glare vanished, and the reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was Spencer. His hands were running through familiar, perfectly highlighted blonde hair. The woman tilted her head back, laughing at something he whispered, and I saw her profile completely clearly. It was Patricia, my mother. My mother is 58 years old, but she spends a small fortune to look at least 15 years younger. She is a local socialite, a woman who views every room she enters as a stage, and every person in it as either an audience member or competition. Standing there on the wooden deck, I felt a strange, chilling sensation wash over my entire body. I did not drop my bag. I did not gasp. I did not bang my fists against the glass. In my line of work, when you catch a fraudster in the act, you do not alert them. You gather your evidence. You build your case. You secure the perimeter. I carefully set my suitcase down on the deck. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the camera application, switched to video mode, and hit the red record button. Through the glass, the lens captured everything in high definition. I zoomed in slightly, ensuring their faces were clearly visible. As I watched my husband kiss my mother on the couch, I had paid for my mind began to connect decades of toxic puzzle pieces. Growing up, Patricia never treated me like a daughter. She treated me like a rival she had to constantly keep in check. When I graduated at the top of my university class, she spent the entire celebration dinner talking about her new personal trainer and how she still fit into her high school jeans. When Spencer and I got married 3 years ago, Patricia showed up to the ceremony wearing a custom-fitted ivory silk gown. It was practically a wedding dress. People whispered about it all night, but she simply played the innocent card, claiming it was just a pale shade of champagne. I kept the camera steady. My breathing was slow and measured. I watched Spencer smile at her, that same charming smile he used to win me over. I realized now why Patricia had always been so overly affectionate with him. She always insisted on hugging him a little too long at family gatherings. She always brought him his favorite expensive coffees. She constantly told me how lucky I was to have a man who paid attention to his appearance, subtly jabbing at my own preference for practical business suits and sensible shoes. I had always brushed it off as my mother just being her usual narcissistic self. I thought she just wanted the attention of a handsome younger man. I never in a million years calculated that they were actually sleeping together in my own living room. After recording for 2 full minutes, I pressed stop. The evidence was secured. It was saved to my phone and automatically backed up to my secure cloud storage. They could not delete it, they could not deny it. They could not gaslight me into believing I was crazy. I slowly backed away from the window, taking careful, deliberate steps to ensure I did not step on any loose wooden boards that might creak. I retreated down the deck stairs and walked back along the side of the house, hiding myself behind a large row of thick evergreen bushes near the driveway. The shadows of the late afternoon concealed me completely. I unlocked my phone and went to my contacts. I did not call my sister. I did not call my best friend. I called the one person who needed to know exactly what was happening in this family. I tapped the name, Richard, my father. Richard is 60 years old and a self-made real estate developer. He is a stoic man who built a massive fortune through calculated risks and absolute ruthlessness in the boardroom. He is not a man of many emotions, but he has always respected my intelligence. He paid for my accounting degree and always told me to trust numbers because numbers do not lie. The phone rang twice before he answered. His voice was deep and steady. He asked me how the audit in Chicago was going and if I was at the airport. I took a silent breath, holding the phone close to my mouth. I kept my voice low and completely flat. I told him I was not in Chicago. I told him I was standing in the bushes outside my own house. I told him I just looked through the patio window and saw his wife kissing my husband. I told him I had a 2-minute video of it on my phone. There was a profound, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I expected him to yell. I expected him to ask if I was joking. I expected the sound of glass breaking or him cursing. Instead, Richard proved exactly why he was a terrifying opponent in business. When he finally spoke, his voice was chillingly calm. It was the voice of a man who had just flipped a switch from husband to executioner. He told me to listen to him very carefully. He told me not to go inside under any circumstances. He told me not to let them see me and not to make a single sound. He said he was 10 minutes away and that I needed to stay exactly where I was. Then he hung up. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. I crouched slightly behind the evergreens, peering through the branches. From this angle, I could see into the side window of the living room. Patricia and Spencer had finally separated. I watched my mother walk over to the antique globe bar cart in the corner of the room. It was a gift I had bought for Spencer on our first anniversary. I watched Patricia pick up a crystal decanter. It was my father's most expensive scotch, a rare bottle he kept at our house for special occasions. The sheer audacity of the scene made my blood run cold. She was pouring her husband's premium scotch for her son-in-law after sleeping with him on her daughter's couch. They stood by the fireplace, clinking their glasses together like they were celebrating a victory. Spencer looked entirely too comfortable. He looked like a man who believed he had successfully conquered both the mother and the daughter. He believed he had secured his financial future through me and his ego through her. He did not realize that I controlled the accounts. He did not realize that the credit cards in his wallet were tied to my name. My forensic accountant brain began categorizing the upcoming destruction. Spencer was no longer a partner, he was a hostile entity. Patricia was no longer a mother, she was a liability that needed to be liquidated from my life. The minutes dragged on like hours. The air started to turn slightly chilly as the sun began to dip lower behind the trees. I stood there in my tailored gray blazer, feeling the cold seep into my bones. But I did not shiver. The anger inside me was a quiet, burning furnace. I thought about all the times Patricia had made me feel inadequate. I thought about all the times Spencer had complained about my long working hours, telling me I needed to be more present at home. He was using my career as a weapon to make me feel guilty, while simultaneously using my absence to sleep with my mother. It was a brilliant manipulation strategy. If I had not come home 3 days early, they would have continued this disgusting charade indefinitely. I checked my watch. 8 minutes had passed since I spoke to my father. I kept my eyes fixed on the street at the end of our long driveway. I wondered what Richard was going to do when he arrived. I wondered if he would break the door down, or if he would quietly walk in and confront them. I wondered if this would be the end of their 35-year marriage. I knew my father had a prenuptial agreement. I knew Patricia had spent her entire adult life relying on his massive wealth to fund her country club lifestyle, her designer clothes, and her expensive cosmetic procedures. She was about to lose everything. At exactly the 10-minute mark, the sound of heavy tires crushing the gravel echoed down the street. A black luxury SUV turned the corner and glided smoothly up our driveway. It was my father's car. I stayed hidden behind the evergreens, waiting for Richard to step out. The vehicle came to a complete stop right next to Spencer's sports car. The engine cut off. I expected the driver's side door to fly open. I expected my father to storm out with fury in his eyes. But instead, the passenger side door opened first. The person who stepped out onto the concrete was not my father. It was not a police officer. It was a plot twist that would turn this entire family inside out. The crunch of gravel under premium tires grew louder as my father's black luxury SUV crawled up our driveway. I stayed perfectly still behind the thick evergreen bushes, my blazer blending into the afternoon shadows. In my line of work, you train yourself to remain detached, but watching my father arrive to dismantle my marriage tested my professional composure. The vehicle glided to a halt next to Spencer's flashy sports car. The engine cut off, leaving a suffocating silence over the driveway. I expected my stoic and ruthless father to storm out and march toward the patio doors to tear Spencer apart. Instead, the driver's side door remained shut. The first door to open was the passenger side. A pair of worn canvas sneakers stepped tentatively onto the concrete. I pushed a pine branch aside to get a better view. The person who stood up was not my father. It was a young woman. She looked no older than 22. She had messy brown hair and wore an oversized gray sweater that failed to hide the undeniable curve of a heavily pregnant stomach. I recognized her instantly. It was Lexi. She was a barista at the upscale coffee shop just 3 blocks from my accounting firm. Spencer always insisted on stopping at that specific cafe. My analytical brain immediately began calculating timelines. Why was the pregnant barista getting out of my father's car in my driveway? Lexi wrapped her arms around her belly, looking terrified standing in front of my manicured suburban home. Before my mind could process Lexi, the rear door of the SUV opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped smoothly into the autumn air. It was Jamal. He is 34 years old, a brilliant black man who also happens to be my younger sister Samantha's husband. More importantly, Jamal is one of the most ruthless family law attorneys in the state. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit, holding a thick leather briefcase in his right hand. When he shows up with his briefcase, it means someone is about to lose everything they own. I watched as he walked around the back of the SUV, his face an absolute mask of professional steel. He placed a reassuring hand on Lexi's shoulder, guiding her gently toward the front of the vehicle. My confusion was spiraling into a deep, chilling clarity. Finally, the driver's side door opened. Richard stepped out. My father looked exactly as he did when preparing to hostilely take over a rival real estate firm. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. I stepped out from behind the bushes and walked onto the driveway. The gravel crunched beneath my sensible low heels. The 3 of them turned to look at me. Lexi looked down at her shoes, flushing crimson. Jamal gave me a curt professional nod, a silent acknowledgement of the impending war. My father simply walked up to me and stopped a few feet away. He did not hug me. We are not that kind of family. He looked into my eyes and saw the cold, hard reality reflecting back at him. I asked him what was going on and why Jamal and the barista were standing in my driveway. Richard kept his voice low, ensuring the sound would not carry to the patio windows. He explained he hired Jamal secretly a month ago. In his real estate development company, my father handles the properties. But Spencer had recently been given access to manage several commercial investment portfolios. It was supposed to be a stepping stone for Spencer to prove his worth. But Richard noticed discrepancies. Small amounts of money were bleeding out of the accounts. He brought Jamal in to do a quiet financial dig off the books. Jamal opened his leather briefcase right there on the hood of my father's SUV. He pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements and handed them to me. As a forensic accountant, I did not need more than 10 seconds to read the story the numbers were telling. Spencer was actively embezzling funds. Jamal pointed to a series of recurring wire transfers. He explained he followed the missing money straight to a luxury apartment complex downtown. He hired a private investigator to see who was living there. The answer was Lexi. Jamal told me Spencer had been paying for Lexi's rent and medical bills for the past 7 months, using funds siphoned directly from my father's company and from joint credit cards tied to my own name. Lexi looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. She told me Spencer promised her he was leaving me. He told her I was a cold workaholic who never wanted children. My father placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. He told me they came here today to confront Spencer about the embezzlement and the pregnant mistress. They brought Lexi to force a full confession so Spencer could not lie his way out. Richard looked at me, his jaw clenching. He said they had absolutely zero idea that Patricia was involved in any of this. They thought she was at the country club getting a facial. It was not until my phone call 10 minutes ago that my father realized the true depths of the betrayal happening inside my house. The corporate embezzlement, the pregnant barista, and the affair with my own mother were colliding all at once. Jamal closed his briefcase with a sharp, definitive click. He looked at the front door of my house and then back at me. He asked if I was ready. I looked at Lexi holding her pregnant stomach. I looked at Jamal holding the financial ruin of my husband. I looked at my father, who just realized his wife of 35 years was drinking his scotch after sleeping with his son-in-law. I adjusted the lapels of my blazer and nodded my head. I told them I was absolutely ready to start the audit. We walked up the concrete path toward the front door, moving together like a synchronized tactical unit. The afternoon sun cast long shadows behind us, stretching across the manicured lawn that Spencer always paid someone else to mow. I held my house key in my right hand, feeling the sharp metal edges press into my palm. My father. Richard walked to my left, his posture rigid, his breathing slow and measured. To my right, Jamal walked with absolute purpose, his expensive leather briefcase swinging slightly with each step. And right beside Jamal was Lexi, the 22-year-old pregnant barista, whose life was completely entangled in the financial fraud we were about to expose. She kept her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak front door. I stepped up onto the porch. My hand did not shake. In my career as a forensic accountant, I have walked into hostile corporate boardrooms to confront millionaire executives with evidence of their crimes. I have watched arrogant men crumble under the weight of undeniable proof. But this was my own home. This was my own husband. And yet my heart rate remained perfectly steady. I slid the brass key into the lock. The mechanical click of the deadbolt sliding open was the loudest sound in the world. I grasped the handle, turned it slowly, and pushed the heavy wooden door open. We stepped into the foyer as one unified front. The house was entirely too quiet. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background. As we moved from the tiled entryway onto the polished hardwood floors of the hallway, a very distinct smell hit me. It was the rich, smoky aroma of my father's premium imported scotch. The living room was situated at the back of the house, connected to the hallway by a wide, open archway. I led the way, my sensible low heels making deliberate muffled thuds against the wood. Richard walked shoulder to shoulder with me, his presence commanding and terrifying in its absolute silence. Jamal placed a hand on the back of Lexi, guiding her forward, ensuring she did not fall behind. We reached the archway and stopped. The scene unfolding in my living room was almost cinematic in its sheer audacity. Spencer was standing by the fireplace, his back partially turned to us. He was hastily tucking the tail of his expensive linen shirt into his trousers and buckling his designer leather belt. Patricia, my 58-year-old mother, was standing near the antique globe bar cart. She was smoothing down the fabric of her skirt and adjusting the collar of her silk blouse, checking her reflection in the glass cabinet door. Two heavy crystal glasses filled with amber liquid sat on the marble countertop. They were completely relaxed, believing they had successfully stolen an afternoon of betrayal without a single consequence. Spencer chuckled softly at something Patricia whispered. He reached for his glass, taking a casual sip of the stolen scotch. Then he turned around. The moment his eyes landed on the archway, time simply stopped. The glass slipped a fraction of an inch in his hand, but he managed to grip it before it shattered. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost trapped in a tailored suit. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes darted from me to Richard to Jamal, and finally they landed on Lexi. When Spencer saw the heavily pregnant 22-year-old barista standing in his living room next to his wife and his father-in-law, his knees physically buckled. Patricia noticed his sudden paralysis. She let out an annoyed sigh and turned around holding her own glass of scotch. Her carefully constructed socialite smile froze instantly on her face. Her brain desperately tried to process the impossible image standing before her. She saw me first and her eyes widened in shock because I was supposed to be in Chicago for an audit. Then she saw Richard and the glass in her hand trembled. But when she saw Jamal holding his briefcase and Lexi standing there with her swollen belly, Patricia experienced a complete mental short circuit. The sheer shock of the four-person ambush paralyzed them completely. Nobody yelled. Nobody threw anything. The absolute silence in the room was heavier and more suffocating than any screaming match could ever be. I looked at the sofa where just minutes ago I had filmed them through the patio window. The cream-colored cushions were still visibly indented. My father stepped slightly ahead of me, crossing the invisible threshold into the living room. He did not look at Spencer. He locked his eyes directly on Patricia. Richard stared at his wife of 35 years with a dead-eyed expression that sent a literal chill down my spine. This was the woman who had shared his bed, who had spent his millions, who had demanded the best of everything his money could buy. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was completely dry. She took a step backward, bumping slightly into the bar cart. The ice clinked loudly against the crystal glass in her shaking hand. The elegant facade she had maintained for almost 6 decades was cracking into a million irreparable pieces right in front of us. She looked at Richard, searching his face for any sign of mercy or misunderstanding. She found absolutely nothing. He looked at her not with anger, but with the cold, calculated detachment of a businessman looking at a bad investment he was about to liquidate. Jamal adjusted his grip on the leather briefcase. Lexi let out a small, shaky breath, taking a step closer to Jamal for protection. Spencer was still frozen by the fireplace, his eyes wide and terrified, darting desperately around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. I stood perfectly still, taking in the destruction of my marriage. Spencer was the first one to break the suffocating silence. He practically jumped away from the antique bar cart, leaving Patricia standing there looking entirely foolish, holding her crystal glass of scotch. His perfectly styled blonde hair was slightly messy, and a thin sheen of sweat began to form on his forehead. He took a step towards me, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, as if he was trying to calm a startled animal. His voice shook when he finally managed to form a sentence. He called my name and told me that whatever I thought I was looking at was completely wrong. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that echoed awkwardly against the high ceilings of our living room. He looked at my father, and then back at me, desperately trying to piece together a believable narrative. Spencer pointed a trembling finger at the cream-colored sofa and claimed he had tripped over the edge of the rug. He actually stood there in front of my father, my brother-in-law, and his pregnant mistress, and tried to convince me that he had lost his balance and that my mother was simply helping him back up to his feet. Patricia immediately seized the lifeline he threw out. She set her glass of scotch down on the marble counter with a sharp clink. Her posture stiffened as she attempted to summon her usual overbearing socialite persona. She took a step forward, smoothing down her silk blouse, and plastered a deeply unconvincing smile of motherly concern on her face. She looked at Richard and let out an exasperated sigh, calling us all ridiculous for jumping to conclusions. Patricia told my father that Spencer had been complaining about a dizzy spell all afternoon and that she was merely acting as a caring mother-in-law checking his temperature. She scolded me for coming home early without calling, claiming I had startled them both half to death. The audacity of her lies was almost impressive. She was relying on the decades of manipulation she had successfully used to control our family. She truly believed that if she spoke with enough authority, we would all apologize for interrupting her. She ignored the presence of Lexi and Jamal, choosing instead to focus all her energy on gaslighting me and my father into submission. I did not argue with her. I did not yell or call her a liar. Engaging in a screaming match with a narcissist is a losing game because they will drag you down to their level of chaos. Instead, I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I reached into the pocket of my tailored gray blazer and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was still glowing brightly from the video I had recorded just 15 minutes earlier. Spencer saw the phone and his eyes darted nervously between my hands and my face. He took another step forward, begging me to just sit down and talk to him like a rational person. He told me there was no need to cause a scene, especially in front of strangers, pointing dismissively at Jamal and Lexi. Jamal simply stood there holding his leather briefcase, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Lexi shifted her weight uncomfortably, her hands resting on her pregnant stomach, watching the man who had promised her the world crumble into a pathetic liar. Richard remained perfectly silent, waiting to see how I would handle my defense. Our living room is centered around a massive 75-inch smart television mounted directly above the stone fireplace. It is a top-of-the-line model that Spencer insisted we buy, using my annual bonus last year because he claimed he needed it to entertain his important clients. The television is connected to our home wireless network, allowing seamless streaming from our devices. I kept my eyes locked on Spencer as I unlocked my phone. I swiped down on the screen to access the control center. I tapped the screen mirroring icon and selected the living room television from the list of available devices. A quiet electronic chime echoed through the room as the television automatically powered on, waking up from its standby mode. The massive screen flickered to life, casting a bright glowing light across the polished hardwood floors and the cream-colored sofa. Patricia stopped her frantic rambling and turned her head to look at the screen. Spencer froze in his tracks, his hands still raised defensively. I opened my photo gallery and selected the video I filmed from the patio deck. I did not say a single word as I pressed play. The video immediately mirrored onto the massive display in crystal-clear, high definition. It was an undeniable, life-sized broadcast of Spencer and Patricia tangled together on the sofa. Every detail was magnified. The way Patricia ran her hands through his hair, the way Spencer pulled her closer. The way they kissed completely destroyed their lie about him tripping. The truth of their betrayal was playing out right above the fireplace. The silence shattered. Patricia let out a sharp gasp, backing away from the television. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror, watching her infidelity broadcast to her husband. Spencer let out a strangled groan of pure defeat. He slumped against the leather armchair, burying his face in his hands. He realized no excuse could explain away a high-definition video on a 75-inch screen. The tripping lie dissolved into nothingness. I looked at my father. Richard stood perfectly still watching the screen with the cold gaze of a man finalizing a total liquidation. Jamal gave a slow nod of approval. Lexi let out a quiet sob. I hit the loop button on my phone, ensuring the video would play continuously. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and calmly prepared for the very next phase of my strict forensic audit today. The glowing light from the 75-inch television cast long, harsh shadows across the living room floor. The high-definition video of my husband and my mother continued to play on a silent, continuous loop directly above the stone fireplace. There was nowhere for Patricia to hide, and no clever lie she could invent to erase the undeniable visual proof of her betrayal. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 5 people standing in a complete standstill. Then the predictable defense mechanism of a cornered narcissist kicked into high gear. Patricia realized that playing the innocent victim of a misunderstanding was no longer a viable option. She could not deny the kiss. She could not claim they tripped over the rug. So instead of apologizing or showing a single ounce of genuine remorse, she decided to go on the absolute offensive. Her shock melted away, instantly replaced by a fiery defensive rage. She set her jaw, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me standing there in my sensible business blazer. She completely ignored the pregnant 22-year-old barista standing next to my brother-in-law and focused all of her toxic energy entirely on me. Patricia pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest and raised her voice to a shrill, piercing scream. She told me this was entirely my fault. She yelled that I was a cold and neglectful wife who cared more about corporate spreadsheets and forensic audits than my own marriage. Her words echoed off the high ceilings of our home, filling the space with desperate venom. She claimed that Spencer was incredibly lonely and constantly starved for affection because I was always traveling for work or locked inside my home office. Patricia had the absolute audacity to stand in the living room I paid for and tell me that I had essentially forced my husband into her arms. She spun a twisted narrative where she was the benevolent savior stepping in to provide the emotional support that I was allegedly too selfish to give. She told me she was merely comforting a broken man who was crying out for love. She framed their disgusting affair as an act of maternal charity, claiming she only wanted to see Spencer happy because I was supposedly making him miserable. She actually convinced herself that she was the hero in this horrific domestic nightmare. I listened to her unhinged screaming without flinching. This was the exact same manipulative tactic she had used against me my entire childhood. Whenever Patricia made a mistake or crossed a boundary, she would expertly twist the reality of the situation until she was the victim and I was the villain. She weaponized my dedication to my career, trying to make me feel guilty for providing the financial stability that allowed Spencer to play golf 3 times a week. She yelled that a real woman would know how to keep her husband satisfied at home instead of abandoning him to chase corporate promotions across the country. Every word out of her mouth was designed to tear down my self-esteem and shift the blame away from her own moral bankruptcy. She tried to convince everyone in the room that my ambition was a toxic flaw that justified her sleeping with my husband. She painted herself as a martyr who was simply trying to hold our fragile family together through unorthodox methods. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was almost fascinating to witness from a clinical perspective. I watched her self-destruct right before my very eyes. When her screaming failed to elicit a reaction from me, Patricia quickly changed her target. She realized I was not going to break down crying or beg for an explanation. She pivoted sharply, turning her attention to my father. Richard was still standing there, his face an unreadable mask of cold authority. Patricia took a hesitant step toward him, her voice dropping from an angry scream to a trembling, pleading whisper. She reached out, trying to touch his arm, but he stepped back, avoiding her physical contact, as if she were carrying a contagious disease. Patricia began to cry, forcing large theatrical tears to stream down her carefully powdered cheeks. She begged Richard to understand the immense pressure she had been under lately. She babbled about a stressful family situation, claiming she was feeling neglected in their 35-year marriage, and that Spencer was the only person who actually listened to her problems. She tried to leverage their decades of shared history, reminding him of the luxurious life they built together and the prominent social empire they commanded at the local country club. She wanted him to feel sorry for her perceived emotional suffering. She looked at Richard with desperate wide eyes, asking him not to throw away their entire life over one silly little mistake. She actually referred to a prolonged physical affair with her son-in-law as a silly little mistake. Patricia tried to act like a vulnerable, overwhelmed woman who had simply made a poor choice during a moment of profound emotional weakness. She told my father that they could easily fix this if they just kept it quiet and handled it privately as a family. She was entirely focused on preserving her socialite reputation and her access to his massive wealth. She completely dismissed the deep psychological damage she had inflicted on her own daughter. Patricia believed that if she could just manipulate Richard into forgiving her, then my feelings on the matter were completely irrelevant. But she fundamentally misunderstood the man she had married. Richard did not build a successful real estate empire by forgiving bad investments or tolerating blatant deceit. He simply stared at her, listening to every single ridiculous excuse she offered. And as she continued to dig her own grave, my brother-in-law Jamal tightened his grip on the leather briefcase holding the financial evidence. When Patricia finally paused to take a breath, the overwhelming silence returned to the living room. Spencer realized her theatrical sobbing had completely failed to sway my father. He looked frantically around the room and his panicked eyes locked onto Lexi. He decided to employ the most desperate strategy available to a cornered liar. He denied her existence. Spencer pointed a trembling finger at the 22-year-old pregnant barista and loudly demanded to know who she was and why she was standing in our house. He turned to Jamal and accused him of hiring a random actress to frame him for something he did not do. Spencer chuckled a hollow, terrified sound and claimed he had never seen this young woman a single day in his life. He told my father that Jamal was trying to ruin his reputation to cover up his own incompetence at the law firm. It was a spectacular display of absolute delusion. He stood there smelling like my father's expensive scotch and tried to convince us Lexi was merely a phantom. I watched him lie to my face, feeling profound disgust. Jamal did not argue with Spencer. He did not raise his voice or call him a liar. As a highly successful family law attorney, Jamal knows that words are cheap, but a solid paper trail is completely undeniable. He walked calmly over to the glass coffee table, sitting perfectly between the cream-colored sofa and the stone fireplace. He set his thick leather briefcase down on the glass. The sharp metallic click of the brass lock snapping open echoed loudly in the quiet room. Jamal lifted the lid and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized manila folder. He turned to Spencer and held out a stack of heavily highlighted bank statements. Spencer hesitated, but Jamal thrust the papers directly into his chest, forcing him to take them. Jamal spoke with a smooth, calculated authority that commanded the attention of the entire room. He told Spencer that if he did not know the young woman standing near the doorway, it was fascinating that he had been paying the rent on her luxury downtown apartment for the past 7 months. Jamal systematically listed the dates and exact dollar amounts of the wire transfers. He then turned to me and confirmed the most sickening detail. Spencer had not been using his own salary. He had been routing the apartment payments through a joint credit card account tied directly to my personal credit line. He was using my hard-earned corporate money to fund a hidden life with his pregnant mistress. Spencer stared down at the highlighted bank statements, his hands shaking so violently that the papers rustled together, making a pathetic sound. He opened his mouth to formulate another desperate excuse, perhaps to claim his identity had been stolen or his financial accounts had been hacked. But Jamal was not finished destroying him. Jamal reached back into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper featuring a bright blue laboratory logo printed at the very top. He handed it to Spencer, placing it directly on top of the incriminating bank statements. Jamal calmly announced to the room that the document was a certified prenatal DNA test. He explained that when he first confronted Lexi during his initial financial investigation, she was terrified but totally willing to cooperate to find out the truth about the man she was dating. The test results conclusively proved with a 99.9% statistical probability that Spencer was the biological father of the unborn child she was currently carrying. Patricia gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. The reality that her young, handsome, secret lover was about to become a father with a girl less than half her age shattered her fragile, narcissistic ego into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Spencer looked at the official DNA test, and his knees buckled slightly. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and entirely defeated. There were no more lies left to tell today. The forensic financial evidence and the undeniable biological proof had cornered him permanently in a dark trap of his own making. For the first time since arriving at our house, Lexi finally found her courageous voice. She stepped away from the doorway and walked closer to the center of the massive living room. Her oversized gray sweater draped heavily over her pregnant stomach as she glared fiercely at the manipulative man who had derailed her young life. Tears streamed down her flushed face, but her voice was surprisingly steady and filled with a deep, agonizing sense of betrayal. She looked directly into Spencer's terrified, wide eyes and asked him exactly how he could stand there and pretend he did not know the biological mother of his first child. Lexi told the entire shocked room that Spencer had repeatedly promised her a beautiful future together. She bravely revealed that he had solemnly sworn to her that his marriage to me was entirely loveless and strictly a boring financial arrangement to keep up appearances. She told me Spencer constantly claimed I was a cold, miserable corporate woman who hated children and stubbornly refused to give him a real loving family. He promised Lexi that as soon as he secured his highly anticipated upcoming promotion at my father's real estate company, he was going to file for a quick divorce and move her into a gorgeous house in the wealthy suburbs. Hearing his calculated emotional manipulations repeated out loud sealed his absolute public doom. He had ruthlessly played all of us using my hard-earned money, my father's influential business connections, and my mother's desperate, fading vanity to silently fund a secret fantasy life that was now collapsing violently around him. I stood incredibly tall, quietly, adjusting my tailored gray business blazer, feeling fully ready to finally finalize the ultimate financial audit of his completely pathetic life. The echo of Lexi speaking her truth faded into the heavy air of the living room, leaving a suffocating tension in its wake. Patricia stood completely frozen near the antique bar cart, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Her meticulously crafted illusion of being the benevolent matriarch had been utterly obliterated by a single piece of laboratory paper. She looked at Spencer cowering by the fireplace, and then she looked at Richard, whose cold, unyielding stare offered absolutely no salvation. Most people in her position would have collapsed in shame or begged for forgiveness on their hands and knees. But a true narcissist does not surrender when they are backed into a corner. They simply look for a heavier weapon. I watched my mother physically straighten her spine, pulling her shoulders back, as a dark, terrifying clarity washed over her face. She stepped away from the bar cart and walked deliberately across the room, placing herself directly between my cheating husband and the rest of us. It was a clear physical declaration of war. She was choosing the man who had just been proven to have a pregnant 22-year-old mistress over her own flesh and blood. Patricia raised her chin and looked down her nose at me, her eyes burning with a desperate, vicious need to regain total control of the narrative we were currently in. She decided that if she could not win the moral argument, she was going to win the legal one. Patricia took another step forward, pointing a manicured finger at the polished hardwood floors beneath my feet. Her voice lost its frantic, hysterical edge and became completely ice-cold, calculating and dripping with absolute venom. She asked me if I honestly believed I had the ultimate power to march directly into this house and conduct a ridiculous witch hunt against her and Spencer today. She reminded me with a cruel, twisted smile that I was standing on property that did not legally belong to me. When Spencer and I first got married, we chose this beautiful suburban house, but we did not have the upfront cash for the massive down payment. Richard generously purchased the home for us, but he placed the actual deed inside a revocable family trust for tax purposes. What I had momentarily forgotten in the chaos of the afternoon was that Patricia was listed as the primary managing trustee of that specific real estate portfolio. She looked me dead in the eyes and weaponized that legal loophole with gleeful malice. She loudly declared that even though I had faithfully paid the monthly mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, and every single utility bill for the past 3 years, the house was technically and legally hers. She held the ultimate authority over the property, and she was absolutely thrilled to remind me of my sudden vulnerability. She stood there in the home I furnished and told me I was nothing more than a glorified tenant. Having established her perceived dominance, Patricia immediately began issuing her tyrannical demands. She ordered me to go upstairs to my bedroom, pack whatever clothes I could fit into my small travel suitcase, and leave the premises immediately. She told me I was officially evicted from her property effective right this very second. She did not stop there. She turned her venomous gaze toward Jamal and Lexi, calling them unwelcome trespassers who were muddying her expensive rugs. Patricia threatened to pick up her phone and dial the local police department to have all 3 of us forcibly removed by armed officers if we did not walk out the front door in the next 5 minutes. She actually believed that leveraging the house would force me to back down and apologize. She thought I would be so terrified of losing my home that I would sweep the affair, the embezzlement, and the pregnant mistress completely under the rug. She looked over at Spencer, expecting him to look grateful for her aggressive protection. Then she looked over at Richard, expecting my father to support her authoritative decision, since he was the one who originally funded the trust. But Richard remained completely silent, a silent observer watching a disastrous financial investment finally crash and burn. Patricia mistook his silence for approval, and her confidence swelled to a truly delusional level. She crossed her arms tightly over her silk blouse, waiting impatiently for me to run away in tears. I stood perfectly still, silently absorbing the absolute magnitude of her maternal betrayal. My own mother was attempting to legally throw me out into the street so she could play house with my cheating, embezzling husband. She was willing to destroy my entire life just to protect her fragile ego and her twisted, inappropriate romance. But Patricia severely underestimated the woman she had raised. She thought she was dealing with a heartbroken daughter who would crumble under the threat of losing a roof over her head. She forgot that she was dealing with a highly trained forensic accountant who spent every single day dismantling complex financial structures. I did not panic, and I did not cry. I looked over at Jamal, who was still standing next to Lexi holding his leather briefcase. Jamal gave me a very slow, subtle nod of his head, communicating volumes without saying a single word. As a family law attorney, he knew exactly what Patricia had just done. By publicly asserting her control over the trust to protect a man who was actively stealing from my father's company, she had just committed a massive breach of her fiduciary duties. She thought the trust was her ultimate trump card, but it was actually the exact piece of evidence we needed to completely destroy her financial future. I looked back at my mother, feeling a cold, mechanical calmness wash over my brain. I was fully prepared to dismantle her entire empire permanently and without a single ounce of regret for what was about to happen next. I did not give my mother the satisfaction of a screaming match. When you are dealing with a hostile corporate takeover, you do not stand in the boardroom and cry. You pack your briefcase and you prepare your legal filings. I turned my back on Patricia and walked up the hardwood stairs to the master bedroom I had shared with Spencer for 3 years. I pulled a medium-sized leather suitcase from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. I did not pack memories. I did not pack the expensive jewelry Spencer had bought me using my own money. I packed sensible business suits, comfortable shoes, and my highly encrypted work laptop. I moved with absolute precision, ignoring the pounding in my chest. Within 10 minutes, I walked back down the stairs. The massive television was still glowing brightly in the living room, playing the undeniable evidence of their betrayal on a continuous silent loop. Patricia was still standing near the bar cart, her arms crossed tightly, looking incredibly smug, because she thought her real estate threat had successfully terrified me into absolute submission. Spencer could not even look me in the eye as I passed him. I rolled my suitcase right past them out the front door and walked directly toward my father's luxury vehicle, where Jamal and Lexi were waiting in the driveway. I was not running away in defeat. I was simply relocating my command center to prepare for a massive counterattack. My father drove us away from the property in complete, suffocating silence. The heavy atmosphere inside the car was thick with the unspoken realization that our entire family structure had just been permanently destroyed. Lexi sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window with tears streaming down her face, finally realizing the charming man she loved was a complete monster. Richard dropped Jamal, Lexi, and me off at the large wrought iron gates of Jamal's property. Before he drove away, my father looked at me through the open window and told me to do whatever it took to completely dismantle them. He promised he would handle Patricia on his end. Jamal and my younger sister Samantha live in a beautiful modern home sitting on 2 acres of land in a quiet upscale neighborhood. Tucked away behind their main property is a spacious, comfortable guest house, which Jamal immediately offered to me as a permanent safe haven. As we walked up the long paved driveway, the front door of the main house flew open. Samantha rushed out to meet us. My sister is 31 years old, and unlike me, she wears her heart completely on her sleeve. She had been waiting anxiously for Jamal to return from his financial investigation meeting, and she immediately sensed that something had gone horribly wrong when she saw me rolling my suitcase up her driveway with a pregnant 22-year-old barista walking slowly behind us. We stepped inside their spacious, brightly lit living room, and Jamal gently sat her down to explain the entire situation. He told her about the corporate embezzlement, the DNA test, and the high-definition video I had recorded of our mother kissing my husband on my own sofa. Samantha reacted exactly the way a fiercely loyal sister should react. She did not cry or ask if it was all a massive misunderstanding. She completely exploded with a volcanic, blinding rage. Her face turned bright red as she aggressively grabbed her car keys from the glass entryway table. She loudly declared she was going to drive straight back to my house and physically drag Patricia out onto the street by her expensive blonde hair. She screamed that she was going to gather all of Spencer's tailored suits and burn them on the front lawn for everyone in the affluent neighborhood to see. She recounted years of Patricia's toxic behavior, yelling that our mother had finally crossed a line she could never uncross. It took both Jamal and me to physically block her from walking out the front door. Jamal placed his large hands firmly on her shoulders, his calm, steady presence grounding her chaotic, emotional energy. I looked my younger sister directly in the eyes and told her that physical violence would only give Patricia exactly what she wanted. It would allow our manipulative mother to play the ultimate victim and call the local police on us. I explained that a physical confrontation would simply result in a temporary misdemeanor charge, but what I was currently planning to do would result in permanent generational ruin. I promised Samantha that Patricia and Spencer were going to pay dearly for their ultimate betrayal, but they were going to pay through the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the American legal and financial systems. Samantha slowly put her keys back on the table, her breathing heavy, but her intense focus completely realigned. We escorted Lexi to the cozy guest bedroom, ensuring she had plenty of water and a quiet, comfortable place to rest her pregnant body away from the extreme drama. Then, the 3 of us moved into the massive, formal dining room. This space was no longer a place for happy family dinners or holiday gatherings. We systematically transformed the long oak dining table into an absolute war room. Jamal opened his thick leather briefcase and began carefully stacking the printed bank statements, the real estate trust documents, and the corporate expense ledgers across the polished wood surface. I plugged my encrypted work laptop into the wall outlet and quickly connected to my secure corporate cloud servers. In that exact moment, a profound psychological shift occurred inside my brain. The heartbroken, betrayed wife ceased to exist entirely. She was completely replaced by a cold, highly weaponized forensic accountant. I looked down at the chaotic pile of financial documents, and I did not see a ruined marriage or a shattered toxic family. I saw vulnerable data points. I saw hidden digital trails. I saw a complex, intricate puzzle of wire fraud, hidden assets, and potential tax evasion just waiting to be expertly decoded. I pulled up a fresh blank spreadsheet on my screen and slowly cracked my knuckles. It was finally time to follow the money, and I was fully prepared to audit my cheating husband and my narcissistic mother straight into absolute poverty. Let me tell you exactly what happens when two financial and legal experts decide to tear your life apart. Jamal and I sat at the long oak dining table with our laptops glowing in the dim evening light. Samantha kept our coffee cups completely full while we worked in absolute focused silence. I logged into my secure corporate server and bypassed the standard viewing portals. Because my name was still legally attached to the joint accounts I shared with Spencer, I had full authorization to request deep archival records from the banking institutions. Jamal used his legal credentials to pull the historical tax filings for the revocable family trust that Patricia so proudly claimed to control. As a forensic accountant, I do not just look at the current balances. I look at the historical flow of every single dollar. I track where the money originated, who authorized the transfer, and exactly where it ultimately landed. Numbers never lie, and they certainly do not gaslight you. The digital paper trail we began to uncover painted a truly sickening portrait of my mother's profound financial abuse over the past 2 decades. I opened the oldest files first, tracing the trust back to when I was just 18 years old. Growing up, Patricia always told me that my father was incredibly strict with his money. She constantly claimed that his real estate business was struggling and that we needed to tighten our belts. When I received my acceptance letter to my top choice university, Patricia sat me down at the kitchen table and cried fake tears. She told me the family trust simply did not have the liquid funds to cover my college tuition. She convinced me that I needed to take out massive student loans and work 2 part-time jobs to pay for my own education. I spent 4 years waiting tables late at night and eating cheap noodles just to survive while maintaining a perfect academic record. But as I stared at the historical ledger glowing on my laptop screen, the absolute truth hit me like a physical punch. The trust was never empty. In fact, during my freshman year of college, my father deposited over $200,000 specifically designated for my educational expenses. My hands started to shake not from sadness, but from a deep, blinding anger as I followed the digital footprints of that money. Patricia, as the primary managing trustee, had deliberately diverted my tuition funds. She did not use the money to pay my university bills. Instead, the ledger showed a continuous stream of massive outbound wire transfers to high-end luxury accounts. During the exact same months I was crying over my student loan interest rates, my mother was withdrawing tens of thousands of dollars to fund her extravagant country club lifestyle. I found the receipts for her custom designer wardrobes, her lavish international vacations with her wealthy friends, and her incredibly expensive cosmetic surgeries. She literally stole her own daughter's college education to finance her superficial vanity. Jamal looked over my shoulder and let out a heavy sigh of absolute disgust. He pointed to another section of the ledger showing how Patricia had expertly manipulated the tax codes to hide these massive withdrawals from my father. She kept Richard completely in the dark, creating a false narrative that I was simply a fiercely independent daughter who wanted to pay her own way through school. She built her entire socialite persona on the back of my financial struggle. The betrayal ran so much deeper than just a stolen kiss on a living room sofa. This was a calculated, lifelong pattern of narcissistic abuse. Patricia never saw me as a daughter to be protected and nurtured. She saw me as a convenient financial resource to be quietly exploited. Once I fully processed the historical theft of my tuition money, I aggressively shifted my focus entirely to Spencer's current accounts. If Patricia was capable of stealing from her own child, I knew she was deeply involved in hiding Spencer's corporate embezzlement. I cross-referenced the missing funds from my father's real estate company with Spencer's personal banking statements. The pattern was incredibly sloppy, but highly effective because nobody had ever dared to question them before today. Spencer was quietly siphoning money from his commercial investment portfolios and moving the stolen cash into a hidden offshore holding account. But he was not smart enough to do this entirely on his own. He needed someone with high-level access to authorize the initial transfers without raising any red flags in the accounting department. I pulled up the digital signature logs for the fraudulent corporate transfers. There it was, staring right back at me. Patricia had used her administrative authority within the family trust network to manually bypass the security protocols on Spencer's behalf. She was actively protecting his embezzlement, masking his stolen funds as legitimate real estate investments. In return, Spencer was using a portion of that stolen money to buy my mother incredibly expensive gifts and fund her luxurious weekend getaways to exclusive resorts. They had created a completely toxic symbiotic relationship based entirely on fraud, vanity, and mutual deceit. My husband and my mother were not just having a disgusting physical affair. They were running a highly coordinated financial syndicate right under my roof. I looked across the dining table at Jamal. He was rapidly typing up the official legal briefs, preparing to submit this explosive evidence directly to the authorities. The puzzle pieces were finally locked into place. They thought they had successfully played the system, but they left a massive digital trail of undeniable guilt. I closed the historical ledger and prepared to drop the ultimate financial hammer. I took a deep breath and drank my cold coffee, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute clarity wash over my entire mind. I was finally going to expose every single dark secret they possessed and destroy them both without showing any mercy whatsoever, tonight guaranteed. The dining room was completely silent, except for the rapid clicking of my laptop keyboard and the occasional shuffling of Jamal organizing his legal documents. I had already exposed Patricia's historical theft of my college tuition and Spencer's pathetic attempts to hide his stolen money in offshore accounts. But my forensic audit was far from over. I turned my attention back to the primary reason my father had initially hired Jamal: the missing funds from Richard's massive real estate development company. Spencer had been granted access to manage several commercial investment portfolios, and my father had noticed a significant bleed in the capital reserves. I opened the master corporate ledger and began running a highly complex data sorting algorithm that I specifically designed for corporate fraud investigations. I filtered the data to isolate any transactions exceeding $50,000 that lacked corresponding vendor invoices. The algorithm took less than 30 seconds to scan thousands of financial records before it flagged a massive anomaly. A single outbound wire transfer for exactly $400,000 had been executed just 6 months ago. The money had been moved from a restricted corporate development fund into a completely unknown external holding account. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing as I examined the destination of the stolen money. The destination account did not belong to a legitimate construction contractor or a commercial property vendor. The $400,000 had been wired directly into the banking account of a newly registered limited liability company. The company was named Serenity Mountain Holdings. It was a classic shell company structure designed entirely to hide the true identity of the individuals purchasing a major asset. I ran a background trace on the corporate registry database using my specialized accounting software to peel back the layers of the shell company. Within minutes, I penetrated the corporate veil and found the primary registered agents for Serenity Mountain Holdings. The names listed on the official state registry were Spencer and Patricia. My cheating husband and my narcissistic mother had secretly formed a joint corporation. I quickly pulled the property records associated with that specific shell company to see exactly what they had purchased with my father's stolen money. The search results loaded on my screen, revealing a deed to a stunning luxury condominium located in the exclusive ski resort town of Aspen, Colorado. They had used $400,000 of stolen corporate funds to buy a secret romantic mountain getaway where they could comfortably carry out their disgusting affair far away from the suburbs and my father. Finding the luxury condo was sickening, but from a purely legal standpoint, I needed to prove exactly how they managed to authorize the transfer of such a massive amount of restricted corporate capital. Spencer was merely a junior portfolio manager. He did not possess the executive clearance required to approve a $400,000 wire transfer on his own. Someone with high-level administrative authority had to manually override the corporate banking security protocols to release the funds. I accessed the digital authorization archives and pulled the specific wire transfer request form. The document loaded onto my screen displaying the necessary banking routing numbers and the required executive signatures. I stared at the bottom of the digital document, feeling my heart pound heavily against my ribs. There was my father's signature boldly authorizing the massive transfer to the shell company. But as a forensic accountant who grew up watching Richard sign thousands of legal documents, I immediately knew something was terribly wrong. My father has a very distinct, sharp signature. The signature on the screen was incredibly close, but the loop on the letter R was slightly too rounded, and the pressure of the pen stroke was entirely uneven. It was a remarkably good forgery, but it was still a forgery. I called Jamal over to my side of the dining table and pointed directly at the forged signature on the screen. I explained that Spencer could not have forged this because Richard never allowed Spencer inside his private home office, where his sensitive documents were kept. But Patricia had unrestricted access to Richard's office, his desk, and his filing cabinets for the past 35 years. She had spent decades watching him sign legal papers. Patricia had deliberately forged my father's signature to bypass the banking security measures, effectively stealing $400,000 to buy a luxury love nest for herself and her young son-in-law. Jamal leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the fraudulent document and the property deed. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He looked at me and stated the absolute reality of our discovery. Patricia and Spencer had not just committed adultery or a simple breach of trust. By electronically transmitting a forged financial document across state lines to purchase real estate, they had crossed a massive legal threshold. They had officially committed federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. These were severe federal crimes carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. The magnitude of the situation settled heavily over the dining room. Patricia had stood in my living room just a few hours earlier, arrogantly threatening to legally evict me from my own home using her power as a family trustee. She thought she was an untouchable mastermind, playing a brilliant game of manipulation. She had absolutely no idea that she had left a blazing trail of federal evidence leading directly to her front door. My mother had unknowingly handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy her entire life. I looked at the forged signature on my screen, feeling a cold wave of absolute victory wash over me. I did not need to scream at her or pull her hair on the front lawn. I simply needed to package this undeniable digital evidence and hand it over to the federal authorities. I slowly turned my laptop toward Jamal, allowing him to copy the forged documents and deeds perfectly, without hesitation. The glow of the laptop screens illuminated the dining room table as Jamal and I finalized the absolute destruction of their financial freedom. We had the forged documents and the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud sitting right in front of us. Most people in our situation would have immediately picked up the phone and dialed the local police department to report the theft. They would have sent squad cars to the house with sirens blaring to arrest my cheating husband and my narcissistic mother. But Jamal and I are professionals who understand that a loud, sudden arrest gives fraudsters an opportunity to panic and attempt to hide their remaining assets. If we alerted Patricia and Spencer tonight, they might try to wire the remaining stolen funds to an untouchable offshore account or liquidate the Aspen condominium before the authorities could properly secure the property. We needed a strategy that was completely silent and infinitely more devastating. We decided to execute a quiet administrative asset freeze. This is a highly specialized legal maneuver designed to completely sever a financial target from their money without ever sending them a single notification. Jamal leaned back in his chair and explained exactly how we were going to build an invisible cage around them. Jamal picked up his cell phone and bypassed the standard customer service numbers, dialing directly into the Emergency Executive Fraud Division of my father's primary banking institution. Because Jamal was the official legal representative for my father's real estate corporation, he carried the necessary security clearance to initiate a high-level administrative hold. I sat silently and listened as Jamal spoke to the senior fraud investigator on the other end of the private line. He did not raise his voice or sound panicked. He spoke with the cold, calculated authority of a seasoned family law attorney delivering undeniable facts. Jamal informed the bank that we had discovered a highly sophisticated internal embezzlement scheme involving forged executive signatures and unauthorized wire transfers to a hidden shell company. He digitally transmitted the fraudulent authorization forms and the property deed to the Aspen condominium directly to the bank investigator. The evidence was so overwhelmingly clear that the bank did not even hesitate to take immediate protective action. Within 15 minutes, the investigator placed a total administrative freeze on every single account associated with the family trust, the real estate corporation, and the Serenity Mountain Holdings shell company. The trap was officially set, and the heavy vault doors were permanently locked. But we were not simply satisfied with freezing the stolen corporate funds. I wanted to ensure that Spencer and Patricia could not access a single penny of my own hard-earned money to fund their legal defense or their luxurious lifestyle. I opened a new tab on my secure encrypted web browser and logged directly into the joint banking portal I shared with Spencer. I systematically went through every single checking account, savings account, and shared credit card. I reported the physical cards as lost and flagged the accounts for suspicious activity, effectively freezing his access to my corporate salary. I knew Spencer relied entirely on my premium credit cards to pay for his expensive tailored suits, his daily country club lunches, and the downtown luxury apartment for his pregnant 22-year-old mistress. By clicking a few buttons on my keyboard, I completely evaporated his entire financial identity. He was now a 34-year-old man with absolutely no income, no savings, and no working credit cards. He was entirely dependent on a 58-year-old woman who just lost her access to a massive real estate fortune. The sheer poetic justice of their impending financial starvation was incredibly satisfying to witness in real time. The true brilliance of this silent legal maneuver was the absolute element of surprise. When a bank initiates a major fraud investigation, they do not send a polite email or a text message warning the suspects that their accounts have been temporarily suspended. They simply cut off the money supply and wait for the target to attempt a transaction. I sat back in my chair and pictured exactly what my mother and my husband were doing back at my house. They were probably sitting on my cream-colored sofa, drinking my father's expensive imported scotch and laughing about how easily they had managed to kick me out of my own home. Patricia probably believed her ridiculous threat about the family trust had successfully terrified me into running away like a scared child. She actually thought she had won the war. She had absolutely no idea that she was currently sitting on a completely worthless financial empire. Tomorrow morning, she would wake up expecting to spend thousands of dollars on her usual luxury spa treatments and expensive shopping sprees. But the very second she tried to swipe her platinum card at the register, the transaction would be aggressively denied. She would experience the ultimate humiliation of standing at a checkout counter and being told her funds were entirely unavailable. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously documenting every single financial transaction and preparing the formal legal briefs for the federal authorities. We printed the bank statements, the forged signature logs, and the prenatal DNA test results, placing them all into thick manila envelopes. We had successfully secured the perimeter and cut off their vital supply lines without firing a single warning shot. We had completely neutralized their ability to run away or fight back. Samantha walked into the dining room carrying fresh cups of coffee and smiled as she saw the neat stacks of legal destruction sitting on the table. Lexi was safely asleep in the guest house far away from the manipulative man who had ruined her young life. We had accomplished everything we needed to do tonight. The silent asset freeze was fully operational and completely undetectable. Now all we had to do was patiently wait for Patricia to publicly humiliate herself. She was scheduled to host the massive annual summer charity gala at her elite country club in exactly 2 weeks. She would undoubtedly try to use the frozen trust accounts to pay the caterers and the event planners. We were going to let her walk right into that prestigious ballroom, believing she was a wealthy, untouchable queen, before we finally tore her entire fake world apart in front of 300 people. 2 weeks passed since the absolute disaster in my living room. For 14 agonizing days, the silence from my mother and my husband was completely deafening. Patricia honestly believed that her vicious threat to legally evict me had successfully terrified me into total submission. She assumed I was hiding in my sister's guest house, too ashamed and financially paralyzed to fight back against her assumed authority. Because she had a massive open line of credit at the elite local country club, she had not yet realized that her bank accounts and the family trust were completely frozen by the federal investigators. She was living in a beautiful temporary bubble of pure delusion, entirely funded by the country club's monthly billing cycle. Tonight was the highly anticipated annual summer gala. This was by far the most important social event of the year for the local wealthy elites. It was a massive opulent party designed specifically for people exactly like my mother, to show off their expensive designer gowns and brag about their perfectly curated affluent lives. Patricia was the head of the gala planning committee, a prestigious title she guarded with her absolute life. The country club was a sprawling private estate with perfectly manicured golf courses, towering ancient oak trees, and a massive crystal chandelier ballroom. It was the exact place where Patricia felt the most powerful and untouchable. She thrived on the undivided attention of the local socialites, soaking up their shallow compliments like a starving sponge. Inside the grand ballroom, Patricia was proudly holding court. She was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald green silk dress that undoubtedly cost thousands of stolen corporate dollars. She stood near the towering champagne pyramid, completely in her element. She clinked her expensive crystal glass with the wives of prominent surgeons and local politicians, projecting the absolute picture of matriarchal grace and elegance. Spencer was standing right beside her, playing his pathetic role perfectly. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored black tuxedo, looking every bit the charming, successful wealth manager he pretended to be. However, his eyes darted nervously around the room, occasionally checking his phone. I knew exactly what false narrative Patricia was spinning to her wealthy friends tonight. She was casually telling them that I was away on another exhausting corporate audit, working myself to the bone, while my devoted husband graciously attended the charity gala in my place to support her philanthropic efforts. She was expertly using my physical absence to elevate her own social status, painting herself as the loving mother and Spencer as the perfect son-in-law. They even danced together briefly, pretending everything was perfectly fine. They were smiling brightly and posing for the hired event photographers, completely unaware that a massive financial and legal anvil was suspended directly above their heads. They felt entirely safe, surrounded by private security guards and the velvet ropes of high society. While Patricia was sipping expensive imported champagne and basking in her fake glory, my team was preparing for absolute war. We did not gather in a dark alley or dress in tactical military gear. When you are about to publicly dismantle a narcissistic socialite in front of her wealthy peers, you must absolutely look the part. I wore a sleek, tailored midnight blue evening gown that made me look completely impenetrable. I paired the elegant dress with the sensible low heels I always wore to corporate boardrooms because tonight was strictly business. My younger sister Samantha wore a stunning crimson dress, her eyes burning with an intense protective fire. She was fully ready to watch our mother fall from grace. Jamal looked incredibly sharp, in a tailored charcoal gray suit, holding a sleek leather folio that contained all the federal financial evidence, the forged documents, and the prenatal DNA test. My father Richard wore his classic black tuxedo, his expression completely unreadable and terrifyingly cold. We did not speak much during the drive to the country club. The heavy, suffocating silence in my father's luxury vehicle was thick with absolute determination. We had spent the last 2 weeks meticulously preparing our legal strike, verifying every single fraudulent bank transfer, and securing the wire fraud evidence. We were a highly unified front of absolute destruction, ready to tear down the fake empire my mother had built on lies. The massive wrought iron gates of the country club were heavily guarded by stern private security personnel. Usually attending the summer gala required an exclusive gold-embossed invitation and a strict identity verification process to keep the general public out. But Richard was not just a regular paying member of this elite club. He was one of the original founding real estate developers, who had personally financed the construction of the Grand Ballroom decades ago. When my father's sleek black luxury vehicle pulled up to the security checkpoint, the guards immediately recognized him. They did not ask to see our invitations or check our names off a clipboard. They simply opened the heavy gates and tipped their hats, standing respectfully aside as we glided right through the grand entrance. We parked near the front steps and walked up the grand sweeping marble staircase, together moving like a synchronized storm. I could clearly hear the soft classical music playing from the live string quartet positioned inside the main lobby. We bypassed the busy reception desk, ignoring the confused stares of the greeting staff, and walked directly toward the towering mahogany double doors of the main ballroom. Jamal placed his large hand firmly on the polished brass handle. I took one final deep, calming breath, feeling my heart finally settle into a slow, mechanical rhythm. Jamal pushed the heavy wooden doors open, and we stepped together into the brilliant, glowing light of the gala. I immediately spotted Patricia across the crowded room, laughing loudly and holding her champagne glass high. I stood tall and prepared for the attack. The absolute countdown to her total social obliteration had officially begun tonight. The grand ballroom of the country club buzzed with the low murmur of wealthy conversations and the soft clinking of expensive crystal glasses. Suddenly, the massive crystal chandeliers above us began to dim, signaling the beginning of the formal presentations. The live string quartet gracefully finished their classical arrangement, and the crowd slowly directed their attention toward the brightly lit stage at the front of the room. A local politician, acting as the master of ceremonies, stepped up to the polished mahogany podium and tapped the microphone. He spoke with a booming, overly enthusiastic voice, introducing the head of the Gala Planning Committee. He called her a pillar of the community, a dedicated philanthropist, and a shining example of maternal grace. The applause that erupted from the crowd was absolutely deafening. From the center of the room, Patricia began her triumphant walk toward the stage. She moved with the exaggerated elegance of a Hollywood actress, accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award. Her emerald green silk dress trailed beautifully behind her, sweeping across the polished floor. Spencer was standing near the front row, clapping louder than anyone else, playing the role of the incredibly supportive son-in-law to absolute perfection. Patricia climbed the small set of carpeted stairs and took her place behind the podium, soaking in the undivided admiration of 300 local elites. She beamed with an arrogant, radiant confidence, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to violently collapse. While every single pair of eyes in the massive ballroom was securely fixed on my mother, I made my move. I did not tell Richard, Jamal, or Samantha exactly how I planned to deliver the financial evidence. I simply slipped away from our group, blending perfectly into the dark shadows along the perimeter of the room. My midnight blue evening gown made me practically invisible in the dimmed lighting. I walked swiftly and silently, along the heavy velvet curtains, avoiding the bustling catering staff who were quietly clearing the salad plates. My destination was the elevated audio-visual booth located at the very back of the ballroom. This was the technological nerve center of the entire gala, controlling the massive projection screen suspended directly behind the stage. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase leading up to the booth, my sensible low heels making absolutely no sound on the carpeted steps. When I reached the top, I found a young college-age technician wearing a black polo shirt, sitting behind a complex mixing console. He looked up, startled by my sudden appearance in his restricted workspace. Before he could ask me to leave, I leaned forward and spoke with the absolute unquestionable authority of a senior corporate executive. I firmly told him that I was Patricia's daughter and that my mother had requested a last-minute emergency update to her charity presentation. I did not wait for him to verify my ridiculous story. I simply stepped past him and set my heavily encrypted work laptop directly onto the main control desk. The young technician stammered nervously, pointing to a small silver flash drive currently plugged into the primary computer tower. He told me that Patricia's official slideshow was already loaded and ready to play on his cue. I smiled a cold professional smile and reached out, pulling her flash drive out of the USB port without a single ounce of hesitation. I told him not to worry because my laptop contained the high-definition upgraded version of the files. I quickly connected my computer to the primary projection system using an HDMI cable I had brought specifically for this exact moment. The technician nervously stepped back, allowing me to take complete physical control of the presentation console. I bypassed my complex security passwords and opened the master folder containing all of the federal wire fraud evidence, the forged executive signatures, the bank statements, and the video from my living room. I arranged the digital files into a perfectly sequenced visual timeline of absolute destruction. Down on the brightly lit stage, Patricia adjusted the microphone and began her keynote speech. Her voice echoed beautifully through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers, filling the entire ballroom with her toxic lies. She started by thanking her wealthy friends for their generous financial donations, effortlessly pretending to care about the underprivileged families this charity event was supposedly designed to help. Then she made the fatal mistake of making her speech incredibly personal. Patricia placed her hands on the mahogany podium and sighed a dramatic, theatrical sigh. She looked out into the sea of wealthy faces and began speaking about the profound importance of family values and unconditional love. She had the sickening audacity to mention my name. She told the crowd her daughter Natalie was away on another grueling corporate business trip, sacrificing personal happiness for a demanding career. Patricia shook her head with fake sadness, claiming modern women forget what matters. She gestured toward Spencer sitting in the front row. She praised him for being a wonderfully devoted husband, stepping in to support her charity work while I was allegedly neglecting my duties. Her delusion was suffocating. She publicly assassinated my character to elevate her social standing, while the man she slept with smiled and nodded. Patricia paused, letting her words settle over the sympathetic crowd. She flashed a perfectly rehearsed smile, proudly announcing it was time to show the audience the visual presentation she had prepared. She looked directly toward the back, staring blindly into the audio-visual booth. She spoke into the microphone and cheerfully asked the technician to please start the slideshow. Standing in the shadows, I placed my index finger over the enter key on my laptop. The conflict reached its absolute peak in that fraction of a second. Patricia stood victorious in her emerald dress, smiling brightly at 300 wealthy socialites, completely and utterly unaware of the devastating truth I was about to project onto the massive screen directly behind her. The young technician sitting beside me in the audio-visual booth dutifully clicked the enter key on his console. He believed he was simply playing a heartwarming charity presentation for the wealthy donors. The massive 75-foot projector screen suspended directly behind the stage flickered to life. Down below, Patricia stood at the polished mahogany podium, bathing in the warm glow of the spotlight. She held her head high, flashing her brilliantly white veneers at the audience of 300 local elites, expecting to see the familiar golden logo of her beloved philanthropic foundation appear behind her. Instead, the screen illuminated the darkened ballroom with a glaring stark white background, displaying a highly magnified image of a federal bank transfer authorization form. The massive black text detailed the exact movement of $400,000 from my father's corporate real estate accounts directly into the Serenity Mountain Holdings shell company. And right at the bottom of the document, blown up to the size of a luxury vehicle, was the undeniable forged signature of my father, Richard. A wave of profound confusion rippled through the elegant crowd. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women in glittering designer gowns squinted at the screen, trying to comprehend why a highly sensitive corporate financial document was being broadcast at a summer charity gala. Patricia, still facing the audience, noticed the sudden shift in the crowd's expression. Her triumphant smile faltered slightly as she heard the low murmur of confused whispers spreading across the expensive tables. Assuming there had simply been a careless technical glitch, Patricia let out a forced, awkward laugh and finally turned her head to look at the massive screen behind her. The exact moment her eyes registered the forged bank transfer, the color completely drained from her carefully powdered face. She gripped the edges of the mahogany podium so tightly that her knuckles turned entirely white. She recognized the documents immediately. She knew that the entire room of influential politicians, surgeons, and corporate executives was currently reading the undeniable proof of her federal wire fraud. The murmurs in the crowd began to grow louder, transforming from polite confusion into sharp, shocked whispers. People were pointing at the screen, recognizing my father's signature and the massive dollar amounts. Patricia opened her mouth to speak into the microphone, perhaps to desperately claim it was a terrible mistake, but her throat was completely paralyzed. Down in the front row, Spencer was staring at the screen with absolute sheer terror. He instinctively took a step backward, bumping into a table of crystal champagne glasses. He knew exactly what was happening. He looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the broadcast, but he was completely trapped under the bright chandeliers. Before Patricia could even attempt to salvage the situation, the presentation software on my encrypted laptop automatically advanced to the next piece of evidence. The financial documents vanished from the screen and were instantly replaced by the high-definition video I had recorded through my patio window just 2 weeks ago. The visual shift was violently abrupt. The screen now displayed my cream-colored living room sofa in crystal-clear resolution. The ballroom surround sound speakers, which Patricia had specifically rented for her grand speech, suddenly blasted the undeniable audio of rustling clothes and heavy breathing. The entire audience of 300 wealthy socialites fell into a dead, suffocating silence as they watched the massive projection of Patricia and Spencer passionately kissing on my furniture. The sheer magnitude of the scandal hit the room like a physical shockwave. A collective, horrified gasp erupted from the crowd. Women covered their mouths in absolute disbelief, while husbands stared in disgust at the woman who had just preached to them about family values. Patricia stood frozen at the podium, completely exposed in front of the only people whose opinions she actually cared about. Her carefully constructed socialite facade did not just crack, it completely vaporized into dust in a matter of seconds. The woman who had spent decades meticulously building her reputation as the elegant, untouchable matriarch of the community was now publicly starring in a disgusting exhibition of infidelity and incestuous betrayal. I watched from the darkened audio-visual booth, feeling a profound sense of cold satisfaction as her entire fake empire burned to the ground. My father Richard stood perfectly still near the back entrance of the ballroom, his arms crossed, watching his cheating wife face her absolute destruction with the cold detachment of a man watching a bad investment finally get liquidated. But the 60-second social destruction was not entirely complete. Patricia stood trembling at the podium, tears of pure humiliation ruining her makeup. She looked down at Spencer, hoping to find solidarity with her partner in crime. But my automated presentation had one final transition left to execute. The video of Patricia abruptly cut to different footage. It was security camera footage Jamal had obtained during his rigorous investigation. The massive screen now showed Spencer standing outside the downtown luxury apartment building, holding the pregnant 22-year-old barista Lexi in his arms. The high-definition footage clearly showed Spencer leaning down and kissing Lexi passionately, rubbing her pregnant stomach with absolute devotion. The audience let out another deafening gasp, louder and more horrified than the first. The ultimate betrayal was finally illuminated. Patricia stared at the screen, her jaw dropping open in absolute devastation. In that fleeting moment, the crushing reality completely broke her narcissistic brain. She realized she was not Spencer's great romantic love. She was simply a delusional, aging ATM machine who had committed federal wire fraud to buy a mountain condo for a man who was already building a secret family with a woman less than half her age. Her public humiliation was absolute and inescapable. There was no way to recover from this massive public disgrace. In exactly 60 seconds, Patricia lost her reputation, her marriage, her freedom, and her fragile ego all at once. The grand ballroom of the country club completely erupted into absolute chaos. The deafening gasps from the 300 wealthy socialites quickly morphed into a chaotic symphony of angry whispers and disgusted shouts. The massive projector screen behind the stage remained frozen on the high-definition security footage of Spencer passionately kissing Lexi outside her downtown luxury apartment. The horrifying reality of the double betrayal hung heavily in the air, suffocating the room. People began standing up from their decorated tables, pushing their expensive chairs back, scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floors. A few prominent local politicians immediately turned their backs and walked rapidly toward the exit doors, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal unfolding before their very eyes. Patricia remained entirely frozen behind the mahogany podium. Her emerald green silk dress, which had looked so elegant just 5 minutes ago, now seemed like a tragic costume on a completely broken woman. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edges of the wooden stand so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. She stared blankly out into the sea of her former friends, watching decades of carefully cultivated social status evaporate into absolute nothingness. Down in the front row, the situation was rapidly deteriorating for the cheating husband who thought he had successfully played everyone in the room. Spencer was trapped. He looked frantically to his left and then to his right, but he was completely boxed in by a wall of glaring, judgmental faces. The pressure inside the ballroom was incredibly intense, but the true source of Spencer's absolute terror was not the angry crowd. It was the terrifyingly calm presence of my father Richard, standing near the back entrance. Richard did not shout or make a sudden aggressive movement. He simply stood there with his arms crossed, staring directly at the young man who had stolen his money and slept with his wife. That cold, unblinking stare broke Spencer's remaining resolve entirely. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that he was facing federal prison time for the $400,000 wire fraud. He knew my father had the endless financial resources to hire the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the country to ensure he served a maximum sentence behind bars. Panic completely hijacked Spencer's rational brain. The survival instinct of a cornered, cowardly rat kicked into overdrive. He decided in that exact terrifying moment that his only possible path to salvation was to completely sacrifice the woman standing on the stage. Spencer practically shoved his way past a group of shocked surgeons and scrambled up the carpeted stairs of the stage. He moved with a frantic, uncoordinated desperation, completely ruining the sharp, tailored look of his expensive black tuxedo. Patricia turned her head slightly as he approached her tear-filled eyes, searching his panicked face for any sign of comfort or mutual defense. She mistakenly believed that her young, handsome lover was rushing to the podium to protect her from the angry crowd. She actually reached her trembling hand out toward him, expecting him to hold it firmly. Instead of offering her a comforting embrace, Spencer violently swatted her hand away. The physical rejection was so aggressive that Patricia stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hem of her expensive silk gown. Spencer lunged forward and grabbed the microphone directly from the mahogany podium. A loud, sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the air, forcing several people in the front row to cover their ears. Spencer gripped the microphone with both hands, his chest heaving as he stared out at the angry crowd and my father. His voice trembled violently, but he spoke with a loud, frantic volume that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He screamed that none of this was his fault. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Patricia, standing just a few feet away from him, and loudly declared that she was the absolute mastermind behind the entire financial operation. Spencer yelled to the 300 wealthy elites that Patricia had actively manipulated him into the affair by threatening to sabotage his promising career at my father's real estate firm. He spun a pathetic, desperate lie claiming he was a helpless young employee who was emotionally and professionally blackmailed by his powerful mother-in-law. The crowd listened in stunned, disgusted silence as Spencer threw Patricia entirely under the massive legal bus. He told everyone that he never actually loved her, and that the secret mountain condo in Aspen was completely her insane idea. He looked directly at my father and screamed that Patricia forged the corporate signatures all by herself without his knowledge. Then Spencer delivered the final, devastating blow that shattered Patricia's fragile world permanently. He leaned into the microphone and screamed that he was just trying to build a normal life with Lexi, but this delusional old woman absolutely refused to let him go. The brutal, descriptive words hung in the air like a physical poison. Delusional old woman. Patricia physically recoiled as if shot directly in the chest. Her mouth fell open in an expression of pure, unadulterated agony. The man she had risked her 35-year marriage for, the man she had stolen $400,000 for, had just publicly reduced her to a pathetic, aging punchline. He stripped away her vanity, her power, and her dignity in front of the entire local high society. Patricia looked around the grand ballroom and realized with terrifying clarity that she had absolutely no one left. Her wealthy friends were staring at her with profound disgust. Her powerful husband was preparing to completely obliterate her in divorce court. Down in the audio-visual booth, I stood beside the young technician and watched the complete psychological collapse of my toxic mother. She slowly sank to her knees on the brightly lit stage, the beautiful emerald silk pooling around her body. The absolute silence that followed the confession was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The destruction was finally complete. The grand ballroom was trapped in a suffocating vacuum of silence following Spencer's brutal declaration. He stood on the brightly lit stage, his chest heaving as he grasped the microphone as if it were a life preserver. Patricia remained on her knees, the stunning emerald silk of her gown pooling uselessly around her on the carpeted floor. She stared up at the man she had risked her entire 35-year marriage to protect, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The words "delusional old woman" continued to ring in her ears, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and bouncing back to completely shatter her fragile, narcissistic reality. The 300 wealthy guests stood frozen in absolute shock. The prominent local politicians, the prestigious surgeons, and the elite socialites were witnessing a level of depravity that even their worst country club gossip could not have invented. Spencer looked around the room, his panicked eyes darting nervously as he realized his pathetic attempt to deflect the blame onto my mother had not earned him an ounce of sympathy from the crowd. He thought throwing Patricia to the wolves would somehow clear his own name and save him from my father's wrath. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the entire situation. He was not the victim of an aging socialite. He was the architect of his own absolute destruction. Before Spencer could open his mouth to spew another desperate lie, a clear, steady voice echoed from the back of the massive ballroom. A young woman stepped out from the shadowy perimeter near the grand double doors, separating herself from the crowd of glittering designer gowns and custom tuxedos. It was Lexi. She wore a simple, understated maternity dress that prominently displayed her heavily pregnant stomach. She looked entirely out of place among the wealthy local elites, but she carried herself with a remarkable, profound dignity that neither my husband nor my mother possessed. The crowd parted instinctively for her, forming a wide, clear path straight down the center aisle toward the stage. Lexi did not shrink away from the hundreds of staring eyes. She kept her gaze locked entirely on the terrified man standing behind the mahogany podium. Spencer gripped the edges of the wooden stand, his knuckles turning completely white as he watched his 22-year-old pregnant mistress walk directly into the blinding spotlight of his public ruin. He had tried to deny her very existence just 2 weeks ago in my living room, but now she was standing right in front of the most influential people in our entire city, ready to deliver the final killing blow to his fabricated life. Lexi stopped right at the bottom of the carpeted stairs, looking up at Spencer and Patricia. She did not need a microphone for her voice to carry across the dead, silent room. She spoke with a sharp, piercing clarity that cut through the heavy tension like a knife. She told Spencer that she had heard every single word he just said. She looked at Patricia, still kneeling on the floor, and then back to Spencer. Lexi loudly announced to the entire ballroom that Spencer had indeed promised her a brand new life. She revealed that Spencer told her he had successfully secured a massive corporate bonus and used the money to purchase a gorgeous luxury condominium in the mountains of Aspen, Colorado. Lexi let out a dry, humorless laugh and stated that Spencer promised to move her and their unborn baby into that exact condo to start their perfect family. Patricia let out a loud, agonizing gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck by lightning. The absolute, horrifying truth finally clicked inside her deeply delusional brain. Spencer had never planned to run away to the mountains with her. He had manipulated Patricia into committing federal wire fraud, stealing $400,000 from my father simply to finance a luxury love nest for himself and his young pregnant girlfriend. Patricia was never his romantic endgame. She was just the gullible, aging bank account he needed to fund his actual secret family. The devastating realization washed over Patricia, completely destroying whatever tiny shred of ego she had left. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably, the sound echoing painfully across the silent room. Spencer tried to stammer a pathetic excuse, but a firm, heavy hand suddenly landed on his shoulder. It was Jamal. My sharp-suited black brother-in-law had silently walked up the stage stairs while everyone was focused on Lex's devastating revelation. Jamal stood tall and imposing in his charcoal gray suit, radiating an absolute terrifying calm that commanded immediate respect. He did not yell or act aggressively. He operated with the lethal precision of a highly successful family law attorney, closing the biggest case of his entire career. Jamal reached inside his sleek leather folio and pulled out 2 incredibly thick manila envelopes. The heavy thud of the paperwork hitting the mahogany podium sounded like a gavel striking a judge's block. Jamal turned to Spencer and slid the first envelope across the wood. He announced clearly that it contained official divorce papers from me, alongside a massive civil lawsuit filed by my father for the corporate embezzlement of $400,000. Jamal told Spencer he had exactly 0 financial assets and was officially barred from returning to my property. Then Jamal stepped around the podium and looked down at Patricia, who was still weeping into her hands. He dropped the second thick manila envelope directly onto her lap. Jamal coldly informed her that she was being served with immediate divorce papers from Richard, an ironclad eviction notice from the family trust properties, and her own federal civil lawsuit for executing the fraudulent wire transfers. Jamal adjusted his tie, looked at the stunned crowd, and loudly declared that the legal audit was officially complete. They were now completely ruined, with absolutely no escape from their criminal actions. The dramatic explosion at the country club was only the beginning of their absolute destruction. What followed over the next 8 months was the cold, brutal, and completely unforgiving reality of the American legal system. There were no more glamorous charity galas or expensive designer dresses. There were only sterile courtrooms, towering stacks of forensic financial documents, and the sharp banging of a judge's gavel. People often think that the best revenge involves screaming matches or physical confrontations. But as a forensic accountant, I can assure you that true absolute revenge is executed quietly on paper through the methodical application of the law. My brother-in-law, Jamal, orchestrated the legal assault with the precision of a military general. We did not give them a single moment to breathe or formulate a defense. We buried them under an avalanche of civil lawsuits, criminal indictments, and divorce proceedings. My divorce from Spencer was surprisingly swift and entirely one-sided. When a spouse uses joint financial resources to fund an extramarital affair, the court considers it a dissipation of marital assets. Jamal presented the judge with the massive binder of highlighted bank statements, proving that Spencer had systematically drained my hard-earned corporate salary to pay for Lexus' luxury downtown apartment and her prenatal medical care. Because Spencer had so brazenly squandered our shared financial resources, the family court judge did not show him a single ounce of mercy. The judge awarded me 100% of our remaining marital estate. I kept the beautiful suburban house, the cars, the investment portfolios, and every single penny in our joint savings accounts. Spencer walked out of that family courtroom wearing a cheap wrinkled suit with absolutely nothing to his name. He was legally stripped of the financial safety net he had spent 3 years manipulating me to build. My father, Richard, handled his divorce from Patricia with the same ruthless efficiency he used to dismantle a failing real estate competitor. When they married 35 years ago, Richard had insisted on a highly detailed, ironclad prenuptial agreement. Patricia had always mocked the document, claiming it was entirely unnecessary, but that document contained a very specific and legally binding infidelity clause. Because I had successfully recorded the high-definition video of Patricia kissing Spencer on my living room sofa, and because Spencer had publicly confessed to the affair in front of 300 wealthy witnesses, Patricia had absolutely no legal ground to stand on. Her expensive defense attorneys tried to argue that the prenup was outdated, but the judge completely dismissed their pathetic appeals. The infidelity clause was triggered instantly. Patricia was legally completely severed from my father's massive real estate fortune. She received absolutely zero alimony, no spousal support, and she was permanently evicted from the sprawling family mansion she had treated like her own personal castle. But losing the divorces was merely the financial preamble to their absolute downfall. The federal authorities had been meticulously reviewing the forged bank transfer authorization forms and the shell company documents Jamal submitted during the silent asset freeze, because they had electronically transmitted stolen corporate funds across state lines. Spencer and Patricia were both formally indicted for federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Spencer was instantly fired from his junior management position at my father's company and blacklisted from the entire financial industry. No wealth management firm would ever hire a man actively facing federal prison time for stealing from his own family. Furthermore, Lexi formally filed for child support. The family court looked at Spencer's previous earning potential and the fact that he had promised to support the child and ordered him to pay a massive monthly sum that he simply could no longer afford. He was completely trapped between the looming threat of a federal prison sentence and a crushing mountain of immediate financial debt. The ultimate poetic justice, however, was watching Patricia experience the brutal reality of her new impoverished life. The woman who had spent the last 3 decades wrapped in emerald silk and sipping imported champagne was suddenly forced to face the real world without a single dime to her name. Because her bank accounts were frozen and subsequently drained by legal fees, Patricia had to pack her few remaining personal belongings into garbage bags. She was forced to rent a tiny, dark one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the absolute outskirts of the city. There was no heated swimming pool, no manicured lawn, and certainly no antique bar cart holding premium scotch. But the loss of her wealth was nothing compared to the complete and total loss of her precious socialite identity. After the horrifying public spectacle at the country club gala, Every single one of her wealthy friends completely abandoned her. The prominent surgeons' wives and the local politicians blocked her phone number and instructed their private security guards to turn her away if she ever dared to show her face near their gated communities. She was entirely exiled from the high society she had worshipped her entire life. She tried to reach out to a few distant relatives begging for a temporary loan or a place to stay, but the viral gossip of her incestuous betrayal had spread far beyond our local town. Nobody wanted anything to do with a narcissistic woman who would steal her own daughter's college tuition and sleep with her son-in-law. Patricia was finally forced to sit alone in a cramped, humid apartment, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the deafening silence of her own absolute ruin. She had sacrificed her daughter, her husband, and her dignity for a fleeting fantasy, and in the end, she was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of her massive mistakes. She now spends her days desperately clipping grocery coupons and riding the public city bus to attend her mandatory legal hearings. The arrogant socialite who once tried to legally evict me from my own home is now entirely dependent on charity. 1 year has passed since the grand ballroom of the country club became the site of my mother's ultimate social destruction. Today is a beautiful sunny Sunday afternoon in late autumn. The air is crisp, and the leaves on the towering oak trees are turning those same brilliant shades of orange and gold that they did on the day my entire life was completely turned upside down. But everything else in my world is entirely different. I am standing on the exact same wooden patio deck where I once hid in the shadows and recorded the ultimate betrayal. But the heavy, suffocating energy that used to haunt this property is completely gone forever. I kept the beautiful suburban house after the brutal divorce was finalized, but I completely redecorated the inside. The expensive cream-colored linen sofa, where Patricia and Spencer committed their disgusting acts, was immediately dragged out and thrown into a rented dumpster. The antique globe bar cart was donated to a local charity shop without a second thought. I painted the walls, brought in bright, vibrant furniture, and essentially exorcised their toxic ghosts from my sanctuary. I am hosting a Sunday barbecue today, and the sounds filling my backyard are no longer lies, manipulation, and gaslighting. They are the beautiful sounds of genuine laughter and absolute unbroken peace. My younger sister Samantha is standing near the outdoor grill, carefully flipping burgers and laughing loudly at a joke. Her husband Jamal, my brilliant brother-in-law who expertly orchestrated our flawless legal victory, is sitting in a comfortable patio chair, drinking a glass of iced tea. He looks incredibly relaxed, far removed from the sharp-suited legal predator he had to become to protect our family last year. My father Richard is sitting next to him, completely at ease with his surroundings. I have never seen my father look so incredibly light and unburdened. For 35 agonizing years, he carried the massive financial and emotional weight of a highly narcissistic wife who constantly drained his resources and demanded absolute perfection to fuel her fragile ego. Now he spends his peaceful weekends playing golf with his actual friends and attending Sunday barbecues at my house. He looks at least 10 years younger without the constant stress of Patricia's toxic demands. The four of us form a tight, fiercely loyal circle. We are the ones who survived the massive storm together. We proved once and for all that true family is not defined merely by blood relation or legal marriage certificates. True family is defined strictly by the people who stand shoulder to shoulder with you when the absolute worst betrayal knocks directly on your front door. Looking back on the absolute chaos of last year, I do not feel a single ounce of sadness or regret in my heart. People occasionally ask me if I miss my mother, or if I mourn the dramatic end of my marriage. They assume that losing a husband and a mother on the exact same day must be an unbearable, tragic loss that requires years of deep therapy. But as a forensic accountant, I view my life through the clear, unbiased mathematical lens of assets and liabilities. Spencer and Patricia were never true assets to my personal happiness or my future growth. They were massive emotional and financial liabilities constantly draining my energy, my bank accounts, and my foundational self-worth. Cutting them out of my life was not a loss at all. It was the absolutely necessary removal of a deep, rotting poison that had been silently destroying my foundation for years. I stopped pouring my hard-earned salary into a dark black hole of ungrateful vanity. I stopped twisting myself into anxious knots trying to earn the conditional approval of a mother who secretly viewed me as her ultimate competition. The exact moment they were legally and permanently removed from my world, my career skyrocketed. I was officially promoted to senior partner at my accounting firm, and I finally had the peaceful mental bandwidth to simply enjoy my own well-deserved success. The harsh reality of their current situation only reinforces my absolute peace of mind today. Patricia is still living in that tiny, dark one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. Her federal wire fraud trial is rapidly approaching, and without my father's massive wealth to fund a high-powered legal defense, she is entirely relying on an overworked public defender. She spends her long days in complete isolation, entirely forgotten and blocked by the wealthy country club elites she once blindly worshipped. Spencer is currently serving his mandatory minimum sentence in a federal minimum security facility for his role in the corporate embezzlement. When he is eventually released, he will face a crushing mountain of financial debt and a permanently ruined professional reputation. Lexi gave birth to a healthy baby girl and is quietly raising her far away from Spencer's toxic manipulative influence. She used the substantial child support payments aggressively secured by Jamal to go back to school and build a stable, independent life for herself and her daughter. The universe truly has a remarkable way of balancing the scales of justice when you finally stop protecting the people who are actively hurting you. I walk slowly down the wooden stairs of the patio deck, carrying a silver tray of cold drinks for my father and my brother-in-law. The afternoon sun feels incredibly warm and comforting on my face. I look around my beautiful, bustling backyard, and I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of deep gratitude. I took my absolute power back by relying on cold, hard facts, undeniable evidence, and the unwavering support of the people who actually loved and respected me. I refuse to be a tragic victim in my own life story. Have you ever had to legally, financially protect yourself from your own family? Let me know in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you believe the best revenge is a life well lived. The most profound lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood relation does not automatically entitle anyone to a permanent place in your life. For years, I allowed my mother and my husband to quietly cross my boundaries because I was conditioned to believe that family requires unconditional forgiveness and endless financial support. But true unconditional love does not involve manipulation, deceit, or the deliberate destruction of your peace. When you discover that the people closest to you are secretly treating you as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished, you must find the absolute courage to cut the cord. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep toxic family members warm. Protecting your assets. Your career and your mental health is not an act of selfishness, it is an act of fundamental self-preservation. Narcissists rely entirely on your silence and your misguided sense of duty to maintain their control over you. The moment you step out of the emotional fog and begin treating their abuse as a calculated transaction, you immediately strip away their power. You learn that your worth is not defined by their conditional approval or their fake social standing. If you are currently trapped in a cycle of family betrayal or financial abuse, please remember that you have the absolute right to walk away and legally protect everything you have built. Do not let guilt keep you anchored to a sinking ship. Gather your evidence, build your support system, and execute your exit strategy with absolute precision. Please hit the like button and share this story with anyone who needs a strong reminder that prioritizing your own peace is the ultimate victory. Subscribe for more empowering stories of survival and reclaim your life today.